So let's go ahead and put those results up on the screen here. You can see that Lula was ahead in the first round, but is going to have to face Bolsonaro in that presidential runoff. I think underperformed where the polls had him to a certain extent. But we have Glenn Greenwald here, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who, of course, lives in Brazil, has broken some of the most significant news about Lula and Bolsonaro specifically. And he joins us now. Great to see you, Glenn.
Good to see you, sir.
Good to be with you guys.
I would love for you, for people who haven't followed Brazilian politics closely, to explain the context here, why this election is so significant, why Lula was in prison, how he got out of prison, and what this election really means in the Brazilian context.
Sure. So, I mean, just to begin with, Brazil is an inherently important country and always has been throughout the Cold War. It's the second largest country in the hemisphere. It's the largest and therefore most influential country in Latin America. It has incredibly important resources, including enormous amounts of oil reserves, as well as the Amazon, which has become the most important environmental resource. So Brazil, just in and of itself, is of great concern now politically to the world. And when you add on top of that the fact that we have now a very polarized political system where there are real differences between the party. We're not talking about, Mitt Romney versus Barack Obama. We're talking about two extremely different and radical ideologies that have now completely polarized, and the entire center has virtually disappeared. There's a lot at stake in terms of the outcome of not just the presidential election, but also the elections beneath that for the House, for the Senate. And there's a lot of interesting things that went on there that I think are really worth talking about too.
Yeah, absolutely. So Glenn, what happened here in the election? I know that the polls had indicated that Lula might win enough to avoid even a runoff. It appears that he performed, I wouldn't say significantly below that, but below that to a certain degree. Does Brazil have the same polling problems that we do? What were the major issues at stake between the two major candidates?
I can't overstate, Saagar, what a humiliating and disastrous night it was for the polling industry in Brazil. I have not ever seen polling this radically wrong in my life. I mean, on the presidential level, it wasn't that terrible. There were no pollsters affirmatively asserting that Lula would win. Some were predicting he would in the first round. But even there, I don't think there was a single polling company that are sort of in the top tier that had the difference any less than 12 to 16 points between Bolsonaro and Lula. And Lula ended up only 5 points ahead. Right. But the races that are most important right underneath that, like governorships in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo and senators for those two most important states, I'll just give you a couple of examples, and they were all in favor of the left. In the Senate race in Sao Paulo, there were two candidates, one on the left and a Bolsonarista, and the polls had the candidate on the left winning by 15 points, and instead the Bolsonarista candidate won by 21 points. So that's a swing of 36 points.
Oh my God.
Here in Rio de Janeiro, they had the Bolsonarista candidate, who's the incumbent, somewhat ahead by 6 or 7 points, but likely to be in a runoff. Instead, he destroyed the left-wing candidate, easily won without a runoff, and won by 32 points. And you go down the list, and over, you're talking about extremely radical errors, all again in favor of undercounting the support that Bolsonarismo has here in Brazil, just like we had two straight elections where there was clear undercounting and underpolling of the support for Trump and his voters as well. So something has gone radically wrong in terms of polling analysis in these democracies.
Do you have any theory, or are there any working theories this morning about what that something is?
It's going to take, I think a lot of work. I mean, these firms have no credibility at this point. I mean, one theory is that because there's so much scorn against Bolsonaro and his movement in elite circles, there's kind of an embarrassment factor that perhaps voters are unwilling to express their support for Bolsonaro to pollsters, but then go into the voting booth and vote for him and his movement anyway. There could be changes technologically in terms of how young people only use the internet and cell phones, all those sorts of things. But when you're talking about errors this dramatic, now not just once, but in 2018, very similar errors took place, again in favor of the left and against the Bolsonaro movement. something has gone fundamentally wrong in polling science, and it needs to be addressed immediately if they want to preserve any credibility for themselves.
Yeah, and Glenn, I was actually rereading an essay that you wrote in 2018 about Bolsonaro's original victory, about polling errors at the time, the issues, what exactly Trump's almost re-election in 2020 really was presaged in what happened in Brazil as well. So in that context, I mean, what lessons do we have? Yeah, like you said, for all democracies about this level of this type of populism and its appeal at the actual democratic level?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, one of the things that has happened in Brazil is something we've seen in many other countries, which is the disappearance of the center right. For 20 years, Brazil was dominated by an election between PT on the one hand, the center-right party PSDB on the other. PSDB barely exists anymore. Conservatives and the right is just Bolsonarismo, or kind of right-wing populism. We've seen that over and over, including in the U.S. increasingly. But I think the real lesson, Saagar, is that, everywhere we see neoliberalism thrive and then wreak havoc on countries, right-wing populism emerges. How many times have we seen that? That's obviously the lesson of the Trump victory in 2016. But even in Brazil, for all the talk about Lula and the Workers' Party being this left-wing party, whether it's because they're not really that or because the constraints of the Brazilian system don't let them be, it doesn't really matter. The way they governed was really more neoliberal than traditionally leftist, just like the Democratic Party in the U.S. And in that wreckage arises right-wing populism due to growing anger, hateful anger towards the neoliberal establishment.
So now my understanding, and I'm certainly not an expert in Brazilian politics, but my understanding is there was quite significant advances under Lula in terms of lifting people out of poverty. There were a lot of schools that were built. There were a lot of social programs that were genuinely beneficial, even as you continued to have, the rich doing quite well and large levels of inequality. So, even as obviously Bolsonaro overperformed the polls, he still came in second here. So what was the message from Lula that was appealing in this round? And then what do you expect is going to happen in the next round based on, the other candidates that pulled votes and who their voters are likely to go to?
Yeah, I mean, so you're absolutely right. But let's remember that Lula has been president of Brazil for 12 years. He was president from 2002 until 2010 when he was term limited out of office. You're absolutely right that not only were there very impressive social programs that even kind of neoliberal centers praised, because they weren't just handouts, they were payments to poor people, but in exchange for proof that their kids are going to school and getting vaccinated and performing other social obligations, the kind of things neoliberals like. It did help a lot of people. Also, during Lula's 2 terms, Brazil had massive economic growth. It became the 6th largest economy in the world, ahead of the UK. But, it's a long time ago. Once Lula was out of office and he was succeeded by Dilma Rousseff, the economy collapsed. There were huge corruption scandals. A lot of anti-PT sentiment arose. But the reality is Lula won. And let's remember, he did win last night in the sense that he got the most votes, primarily because he's just such a gigantic force of personality. There's so much personal affection for Lula in Brazil that does not necessarily translate to other left-wing parties. And you can't really, you have to sometimes in politics realize that a lot of it is about force of personality. So that's a huge factor. I would still rate Lula as the favorite to win in this runoff, though I don't think it's going to be easy as a lot of other people think. But in some sense, Krystal, you're right. But 2010, when he left, was a long time ago, and the next decade was filled with a lot of misery and a lot of suffering.
Right.
So the other thing that was a concern, Glenn, is that Bolsonaro, who made noises in this direction that basically, if he didn't win, then the thing was rigged, and you had a resolution that was passed by the Senate here. The U.S. has been very concerned about Bolsonaro basically claiming an illegitimate victory here. And of course, the context for that is, well, we had a sort of failed and pathetic coup attempt here in the U.S. with Trump and his supporters. There was a legit one in Brazil, that did oust the democratically elected president, which you, of course, were integral in ultimately exposing. So were there noises from anyone last night saying this, result was not fair? Are you concerned about that in the next round as well?
I'm not. First of all, I think the impact of January 6th, calling it an insurrection, or
Right.
whatever is overstated. I regard it more as a riot than
Well,
like an actual
I'm actually not.
insurrection.
I'm not really referring to January 6th as much as I am like the fake elector schemes and the efforts in the courts to try to overturn the election. But we can leave that debate for another day. There were clearly efforts on Trump's side to try to, keep himself in office, and he continues to say, "I'm rightfully elected, and they should just redo the election, et cetera, et cetera."
Sure. I was just trying to say that I never saw the kind of post-election instability or violence in the U.S. as a major threat, and I don't really see it as a threat in Brazil. And to the extent that I did, because I mean, just like with Trump, what I would describe Bolsonaro as being more than anything else during his first 4 years in office was a weak president. I think the world in which Bolsonaro gets everything that he wants is a very dark and alarming world. The reality is Brazilian institutions, and there was an article in the New York Times just a week ago that examined whether or not the Brazilian Supreme Court has become authoritarian in its efforts to kind of limit and stop the Bolsonaro movement. He's really been checked and limited in lots of ways. I don't think he'd have a lot of institutional support in the military, for example, for doing the sort of thing that would be necessary to threaten the election. But the real point, Krystal, is even though Bolsonaro came in second last night, the big winner of last night's election was Bolsonarismo. I mean, his party is now going to be the largest party in both the Senate and the House.
Wow.
His ally won the governorship of Rio de Janeiro and is now the favorite to win the governorship of São Paulo, the two largest and most important states in Brazil. So even if Lula ultimately wins in this runoff, Bolsonarismo in Brazil is not going anywhere. It remains very strong. And I think that has definitely lessened the likelihood that people are going to go out into the streets and create a lot of violence and instability in the event that Bolsonaro loses to Lula.
Makes a lot of sense. Glenn, thank you so much for joining us and for breaking it down. It's just so helpful, and a lot of parallels that we can draw for our own country. So thanks very much. Appreciate
Great to see you,
it.
Glenn.
Yeah,
Thank
great
you.
to be with you guys. Glad you're covering this. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for watching. We really appreciate it. We've got the live show happening in Chicago. It's coming soon. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're planning some very special audience stuff, so you're going to want to be there in the audience. Tickets are down there in the description. We've got the live show or the Counterpoint discount going on right now, 10% off for our annual members to support our work. And you got a little taste of why exactly it's so important to be independent with the Counterpoints interview with Katie Halper. I don't want to lean too hard into that, but listen. That's what it's like when you work for somebody else. It's like, at the end of the day, the only people we work for are our audience, and we don't really care. It was actually very nice. Rogan and Dave Smith, shout out to Dave Smith as well. They both said something about us on their show, which was extremely kind. They're like, look, you may not agree, but they're not lying to you. And he's like, you can just tell, they're telling you what they really think. And I do want to emphasize, that is everything we say is straight from my mouth, your mouth. It's what we actually think. Working it out in real time with everybody, and I think we're all learning together. So thank you all so much for just supporting that. I think it's very helpful to a lot of people.
We put a lot of thought before we launched into how we could avoid both obviously the perils of corporate media and the corporate ad. That was a no-brainer, but also you see independent media can suffer sometimes from audience capture.
100%.
And so we put a lot of thought into avoid any of those sort of influences that can really, drag you in one direction and lead you to, because I think some of these commentators, it's not even that they don't believe what they're saying, it's just that people, if you have an incentive to say a certain thing, it's very easy to fool yourself and convince yourself that that's what you actually think. So in any case, I think that's exactly correct. We really are telling you what we think, even when we get it wrong. We try to acknowledge when we get it wrong and, try to create a buffer around us. And even just having the left-right perspective in one show creates somewhat of a check on either one of us, getting out over our skis. So
if I get something wrong, it's because I got it wrong.
Yeah.
Which is honestly, I like it that way.
Yeah.
I prefer it.
So anyway, guys, we love you. We're grateful for you. Thank you for making this possible, and we will see you back here tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.